Small business owners understand policies enough to see the opportunities that exist within those policies, or is it true that we are waiting for somebody else to see the policy and try to implement it and find opportunities for small business owners to participate? So almost a push versus pull type of effect with policy and our engagement with it.
I think that policies are written with people in mind, with the community in mind. But the vehicle through which government then attempts to implement those policies is where the challenges lie. So you cannot build a vehicle. Government builds this great vehicle in policies, whether it be BBBE, whether it be the mining charter, the financial charter codes, social labor planning, and putting all of those mechanisms in place. And then you have somebody who has no inclination of how to drive this 10-ton truck. Then you put them in the 10-ton truck and you say, you're responsible for driving this 10-ton truck from point A to point B. They don't even know where the ignition is. If anything happens mechanically with that truck, they don't know how to service it. They don't know. So the implementers of policies are the challenge. It's not necessarily the policies, because the policies are written with entrepreneurs in mind, with communities in mind, with growth in mind. It's the implementers of those policies who often misinterpret what is written in those policies, are under-equipped and under-skilled to correctly implement those policies. So it's very easy for us to then go back and say, government policies, these are the issues. But we haven't taken the time, one, as ourselves, as entrepreneurs, and from an entrepreneur perspective, as SMMEs, let's forget the national policies that relate to some of these issues. Do we understand your requirements in the industry within which you operate and you do business, first and foremost? So there are certain standards, compliance that is required if you are an audit firm. Similarly, if you are a legal practice. Similarly, if you are in quality management. You need to, manufacturing, are you ISO compliant? So understanding policy from an SMME point of view begins with understanding policy within your framework of operations and what you do. And do you then measure up in that regard? Then you begin to interpret the broader policies that apply to the wider economy, as it were. Then you begin to apply that to what government is asking for and what government is trying to align to.
Dr. McLean, let's talk infrastructure. We sit with issues of healthcare failing because infrastructure is not there. Transport is an issue. And we've done well in terms of focusing it on the bigger cities. 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference talking about the fourth industrial revolution, and everything was talking about smart cities. Nobody had tapped into smart transportation for rural communities or township-based communities. So what are we doing in that sphere, or what can be done in that sphere, particularly from a small business level? Because I want us to be able to walk out of here and feel like we could do something ourselves, as opposed to waiting for a government to figure this out.
So I think, picking up from the last point, is that policies are put in place to be able to create an enabling environment to address specific problems. And that links in with what Mpho was actually talking about this morning, that as entrepreneurs, you've got to be solving the big problems. And so if you look at health, for example, there are numerous problems in health. And so one can choose to be able to put the hard infrastructure, which is build a hospital in a rural area. And quite often we've seen that government goes out, builds a school because there's an education problem, or a hospital, but then we tend to then forget in terms of the soft infrastructure. Who do we have? The doctors, do we have the nurses to be able to provide the service in that particular infrastructure? Because they're also part of the infrastructure. And similarly, with schools, it's great what Gauteng is doing. We're going to digital, schools and what have you. But do we have the teachers that are actually equipped to be able to use that infrastructure and deliver the service? And quite often we don't. And I think, for me, it's really for the entrepreneurs that are interested in infrastructure to be able to look at the entire value chain, both the hard infrastructure, so are they able to come on board as part of the designers in construction of that infrastructure, or on the soft side of it, can they be able to provide layers of service on that particular infrastructure? And I think the easy one to better understand is if we talk about broadband. I think the opportunity for most of us to get into laying fiber has passed, but there is fiber that is being rolled out. Yes, there's still going to be opportunities for others to maintain, but what are the services that are going to be provided on that particular fiber? And therefore, if you go into the rural areas, part of the question as an entrepreneur is, if I'm going to provide this particular service, who is actually going to pay me? How am I going to be able to generate income? And that is a question that is actually very important. And as entrepreneurs, we cannot expect government to be the one that actually continuously pays us, for that particular service. We've got to figure out how we're going to have a business model that is sustainable beyond government as government shifts, the priorities, to other sectors.
Is anyone in the room involved in projects that require lots of data and you feel data must fall? You involved? Okay, so what are you doing about it from a policy point of view? And I'm asking not to pick on you, but I'm asking to sense where our temperament is to get involved in discussions around policy to actually fight back or, implement better solutions.
Thank you. My name is Angela Makala. Okay, so I'm from an environmental health services company. There is a lot of research that still has to be done in terms of how, because it's now a private sector, it's broadly a municipal level service that we took and implemented it into a private company. So now, bridging those gaps requires a lot of research, a lot of data consumption. We can go from anything from 40 to 80 gigs a month. Trying to cut down on that is a mission. It's really it becomes an overhead cost to us. And this is something that I always say, that even attending events, it requires the data to tweet. You find the memes that when you mistakenly open your Instagram, and it just
it disappears.
But it's something that you have to do to put your business out there. So in terms of policy, not a lot from our company is being done, because we're also trying to focus on the development. But I also feel like with alternatives such as rain and telecom merging with Vodacom, the service will be better. Those are the things that everyone in this room, whatever idea that you can come up with, please do assist, because it's a really huge challenge for us.
Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question? I'm going to open it up for you so that you can get the sort of advice and questions that you want to put forward.
Hi, we spoke about infrastructure in terms of pushing teachers forward in terms of equipping students in terms of moving over to digital world. I noticed a lot about e-learning at the moment. How far has that actually moved through to schools, and is there a limit as to which sector, or what's the scope in terms of pushing out e-learning? Is it like to primary schools, high schools, or to tertiaries? Or has there been update on how far e-learning or online e-learning has gone? Because I know there was a point where you could, where your teacher, you could go home and your students would automatically have access to the lecturers or teachers and whatever was done for the day would automatically be downloaded via a server or a cloud system.
So I mean, I can't quite give you a direct response to that, but I think that the point that I want to actually perhaps put forth is that there has to be a significant mind shift as we introduce things like digital learning or digital technologies into schools. And what I find being a problem at the moment is that we are in essence trying to implement learning, the learning that we have always known, just using digital. And I think that what has to happen is a fundamental shift in terms of learning, per se. And there was a documentary in terms of Finland and how the Finland schools learn, and young people go home, they don't have homework because it's a different way of thinking. And so for me, it's perhaps starting to overhaul our education system, right from the primary, in fact, pre-primary, early childhood development, and letting the kids play with the technology and starting to develop specific skills. And we've got to be asking ourselves, what are the jobs of the future and what do they require? And therefore start to encourage kids to learn how to code, perhaps much earlier. And remember what I said earlier, one of the barriers that I see in terms of e-learning is actually the teachers as well. Because one gets a sense that the bulk of our teachers are still stuck up in the old times. And in essence, it's the kids that are coming in and teaching the teachers how to use this particular technology. And so it really requires, at least in my own opinion, a total rethink in terms of what is the education that we want to have and what are the jobs and the opportunities that we're actually preparing these young people for out into the future.
I think that what I mentioned, a conference she was at that was focused on the fourth industrial revolution. And the question you're asking for me sort of goes in, there's a link to that from your question. But what is important to note is, one, we're a developing economy. And that means two things. That means within our economy, we have a certain portion of the population that is advanced, that has access to all of these technological advancements that are coming in. And you have a huge majority of the population that doesn't. Right? So we need to be very careful in how we go about implementing things such as e-learning. Because the minute you go in to implement e-learning, that means a school in the middle of the Eastern Cape whose primary focus is having working toilets, is having a desk, is having 4 walls and a roof. E-learning is the furthest thing from that principal's mind. So in as much as we can say, we want to, it's a fine balancing act. We have a lot of catching up to do to the rest of the world, but at the same time, we cannot afford to leave people behind, because the people we're leaving behind make up the majority of the population. So it's a fine balancing act that we need to play in the country to ensure that as we're catching up, those who are at a point where we're now looking at e-learning, etc., and your private schools can bring this on board. What are we doing about the schools that don't have laptops, that don't have Wi-Fi, that don't have access to fiber? Because if we're then taking e-learning to those schools, there's a whole lot of infrastructure that's required there. I mean, e-learning works well. Harvard, for example, have a great e-learning platform that you can use, but it's a US institution, right? There's edX online, where you've got access to the likes of Harvard, Oxford, University of Massachusetts. You've got all of these institutions that are online, and they are offering free courses. You can go online and you can do a course in entrepreneurship, and it's free. And if you want a certificate, you pay, $20, and they'll send you your certificate, and there you are. You've done this course, you've got a certificate from this institution. But how many people, even in this room, know about it, have access to it, and more importantly, make use of it? And once you've disseminated that information, now try and apply implementing e-learning broadly.
Please manage my time. I'm not very old. Can we take another question from someone?
Okay, so going back to the issue of policies, in our space, we are the drivers of the tech country. We live and breathe legislation. That's what we're taught from, the first year to the fourth year. That's quite literally all that we do. However, the biggest challenge that we face is with the receiver, the consumer of that legislation, who has become complacent, with issues of sanitation. You find people say, we've been having this pit toilet for 20 years. We used to just move it from one area to another, just to go home, and that's how we've been living. And you want to bring in this fancy system, flushing toilets, hand washing, proper hand washing techniques that we are not used to. How do we work on changing that mindset to say that Black communities, it's okay for you to enjoy the dignified services which technology and the industrial revolution can bring about? How do we go about doing that?
My short answer, education. So we have to be deliberate about how you're educating those people. But let me let the Mpho answer. Because you do a lot of this.
I think I'll answer your question in two ways. One, first step of any work we do, as I said, we have various stakeholders that we work with. But the first step of any work we do, similarly now in Mpumalanga, the first step of our process is education and engagement. You have to engage with the community, right? We cannot sit in boardrooms in the middle of Johannesburg and come up with strategies that are going to impact the lives of people who live in communities that we've never engaged with. So one, we cannot develop solutions for those communities without engaging with those communities and finding out what it is that they need to improve their lives. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's also a key lesson in development and around development. There's a story told by a former Minister of Finance in Zambia where they went in and they put in these taps. They didn't consult the community, but they went in and they built these pumps. My grandmother's village used to have them. You pump the water and you pump. I used to hate fetching water. And you would pump and you would pump and you would pump, and eventually the water comes out on the one end, and you take it home, right? And they came back after a few months. Nobody was using these pumps. Nobody was pulling water out of it. And they said, but gee, guys, why are you not doing this? Why are you not using it? And they said, well, that's because the water that comes out from this area where you've put the pumps is affected by the soil and it comes out red, and we can't drink it, we can't use it, they can't do anything with it. So it's very important in development that you engage with the community that you're trying to derive or a value out of a program for. So that for me is very important. And it goes back to the education. I don't know about that locality. I need to know about it, and the best way to know about it is to engage with the people.
Did you answer? Yeah. I think because now I've got timekeepers, if I didn't tell them about this time issue,
You'd have had more time.
I would have had more time. I honestly feel that. I think what's important is that we encourage one another to participate with, especially issues around policy and infrastructure. We've become very good as an SME community in terms of complaining about what's not working. I would encourage you to start reading some of these policies. So when you hear stuff about budget speech talking about an NPP plan or whatever, figure out what it is and how you can benefit from it and where the opportunities exist. Would you like to say something in closing and for us to wrap up?
you like to go first? I seem to have spoken a lot.
Yeah, so I think if we look at South Africa 24 years down since our democracy, we have probably the best policies that anybody can ever write. I don't think that there is a lack of policies. I think we're at a stage now where we actually need to analyze how well are we implementing. Also look at the legislation. If you look at something like the PFMA or the MFMA, it's not necessarily enabling. Yes, it was created for a specific purpose, but for a municipality to be able to address some of its own challenges using the MFMA, it takes a long time. If you look from a private sector point of view, if you talk about PPPs, public-private partnerships, it takes roughly about 4 to 5 years before a PPP eventually gets to a point of financial closure, and that means that you're signing on the dotted line and you're ready to implement. And so the big thing for me is, perhaps in closing, is one, how do we, as citizens, government, private sector, communities, entrepreneurs, and so forth, start to influence how we implement, and therefore reducing the timelines for decision making, whilst at the same time ensuring that there is transparency, there is fairness, and so forth. The second thing is there are huge opportunities in infrastructure, huge, and you have to, as an entrepreneur, look first of all, obviously around your own communities. If you look at pit toilets, there's an opportunity to be able to actually put in proper sanitation. If you look at transportation, with the congestions that we have, there are opportunities to be able to come up with innovations and businesses that actually address those particular things. Healthcare, there's opportunities on a daily basis for all of us to be able to provide business opportunities in South Africa. And then you look into the rest of the continent, because the problems that you're actually addressing here, they're not unique. We're not different. Yet the market is actually out there. And increasingly we're seeing huge opportunities in the rest of the continent. So I've been spending a lot of my time in the last 3 months. Huge opportunities for South Africans to be able to go in and implement what they have piloted here. So as an entrepreneur, my advice is do your minimum viable products and test the market. Yes, you're addressing a big challenge and you are providing a particular solution. Somebody is prepared to pay you for it, and then start to move up into the rest of the continent.
I think entrepreneurs have to play smart. There's BBBE legislation that requires that 3% of NPAT be spent on enterprise and supply development. There's within the scorecard elements that speak to procurement, and they need to procure from black women-owned entities, from black-owned entities, from youth-owned entities, and entities from rural communities, as well as entities owned by people with disabilities. So if you don't know all of that, how are you going to take advantage of it? So one, read. First and foremost, read and understand your space, understand the space that you're in and the value that you can bring. But more importantly, don't just go to Exxaro and say, I'm a black woman-owned entity, do business with me. The first thing you got to do is show that you're competent, you're great, you've got great quality in your business, you've got great systems in your business, and your business is compliant. And the last thing is, oh, by the way, I'm a black woman-owned entity, do business with me. So that's the added bonus of your business. It's not the first thing that you mentioned, that I'm black, do business with me. It doesn't work that way. If that were the case, none of us would be sitting here and needing business, right? So you got to go first and foremost, read up on your industries, read up on the legislation and the legislative requirements around how the mines operate, what are their requirements, and then approach the mine and say, right, I meet this criteria, and that criteria, and I happen to be a black woman-owned entity. You open up doors for yourself by understanding the environment within which you operate. Lastly, I'd like to say that from an SMME development point of view, it's fundamentally important for SMMEs to be compliant. Compliance is a huge thing. You are not going to do business with Exxaro if you're not compliant. That it really doesn't matter whether you're black, pink, purple, or green. They will not do business with you if you are not compliant. So as an SMME, you need to be compliant. When it comes to legislation, there are various stakeholders in the space. You have your private sectors, you have your implementers, you have the SMMEs, you have the communities. In order to create that ecosystem, you need to develop integrated models. You need to develop integrated solutions that create some form of investment neutrality for the guys who are pouring money in through enterprise and supply development. They need to see a return on investment in their bottom line. The community needs to see that the money they've invested in is benefiting them on the ground, that people are being developed, their businesses are being procured from by these guys. So you need to look at integrated models in order to sustain this ecosystem that you're trying to create.
Out of curiosity, how many of you know how to calculate your BE level into a financial ROI when you're putting through your proposals?
So
that's a small number.
That's one. It's not even a small number.
Okay, it's not a cheat. You either know or you don't know, so it's not a cheat
Pranesh can't
about it,
answer.
right? So. And I ask this because a lot of the times we see proposals that say, work with me because I'm a 100% black-owned company. But you don't know what 100% black-owned actually means into a rand value investment for that corporate, right? So that's a piece of homework from my side, and I think Rabelang is here this afternoon to talk to you guys about that part. So if you don't know that, please go to that masterclass as well. I think my job is done before I get kicked off stage. Thank you so much for participating.